welcome to this episode of Haunted Locations. Today I'm going to be covering the Dr. Mudd House in Waldorf, Maryland, and answering the question of why is it haunted? For those of you who don't know anything about Dr. Mudd, I'm also going to go into a history lesson about Dr. Mudd and tell you a little bit about why he's known in history and what happened to him. So, it all has to do with what happened on the night of April 14th, 1865 in Washington, D.C. So if you don't know what happened that night, John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater. The 16th President of the United States was assassinated. The first sitting president to be assassinated in U.S. history. Now, we all know that. We all know that John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln, but a lot of us don't know the details of the other people involved, or if there were even other people involved. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about that too. So Booth actually had a plan to take out what he believed would be most of the United States government. He had a plan to take out the Vice President, Andrew Johnson, and the Secretary of State, William Seward. He had people he planned this with, and they were supposed to take those guys out. So Andrew Johnson was supposed to be taken out by George Atzerodt, a man from Port Tobacco, Maryland, who was in D.C. that night. At the hotel Andrew Johnson was at, he was drinking at the bar, and ultimately his nerves got to him, and he decided not to follow through, and he left the hotel that night. So Andrew Johnson survived. Didn't even have an attempt on his life. William Seward, on the other hand, didn't get out so easy, but he did survive. David Harold and Lewis Powell went to the house of William Seward, who had recently been in a bad carriage accident, so he actually had a cast around his face. His daughter and his son were at the house. When Lewis Powell knocked on the door, his son answered the door. Lewis Powell said he had a delivery of medicine, but with it being the time of night it was, his son was very suspicious. Seeing that, Lewis Powell quickly pulled out his gun and tried to fire at Seward's son. But his gun jammed and didn't go off. He quickly turned it around and slapped him, pushing him off, running up the stairs. He kicked down Stewart's bedroom door, ran into the room where his daughter was with him, and he started to stab Stewart repeatedly with his dagger. Stab him towards the face. His daughter started screaming out the window, "Help, help, help." Hearing that, David Harold got out. He didn't want to stay down there and risk getting caught, so he fled, leaving on the horse, also leaving Powell's horse unattended. So when Powell thought he had finally taken care of Stewart, he left the house, threw the dagger into street gutters of D.C., and realized Harold left him. Now, Powell knew nothing about D.C. He didn't know his way around at all. So he was kind of lost. He wandered D.C. all night long, and there was only one place he knew to go, or knew how to get to. That was Mary Surratt's boarding house. So he decided to go there. And unfortunately, when he got to Mary Surratt's boarding house, the police were there because her son was Booth's best friend and was considered to be a suspect in the assassination. And they couldn't find him. So when Powell showed up at the house, police asked him what his business was. He said he was here to dig a ditch for her, but it was late at night, and that made no sense. Mary Surratt claimed she didn't even know the guy. Well, police saw that very suspicious and took them both into custody. That ultimately would seal both of their fates. Now, David Harold, once he got out of D.C., he met up with Booth in the countryside of Maryland, just outside of D.C., the suburbs nowadays. And they went to Surratt's old house in what is now Clinton, Maryland, to pick up guns from the guy who rented the house. Now, the guy who rented the house from Surratt was a retired D.C. police officer, but he was believed to have been drunk that night and not really knew what the guys were coming for. They let them in and they got their guns. After that, they realized Booth had broken his leg, or injured his leg at least, at Ford's Theater when he jumped from the balcony onto the stage. So David Harold knew a doctor in Waldorf, Maryland. Booth also knew him. They were friends. They were considered to be friends at least. They arrived at his house around 4 a.m. They rested, and he set Booth's leg. Now that's where the question begins. Did he know anything about the assassination? Did Dr. Mudd know? I don't know if Dr. Mudd knew anything about it beforehand because it was originally a kidnap plot, but I believe Booth did tell him he did it and he didn't turn him in, but ultimately he was a Southern, Confederate sympathizer, so why would he turn him in, Ultimately, Mudd was arrested. The other conspirators I named were arrested, and a few were executed. Those being Lewis Powell, Mary Surratt, George Aserat, and David Harold, who was with Booth up until the end. He surrendered while Booth was shot at the barn in Virginia. Only Mudd was spared a death sentence just by one vote and was instead sentenced to life in prison. Him and Ned Spangler, the guy who held Booth's horse outside Ford's Theater, were both sentenced to life in prison. They were sent to Florida. In the prison in Florida, there was a big yellow fever outbreak, and ultimately Dr. Mudd became the prison doctor, and he helped so much that officials down there pleaded with Andrew Johnson to release Mudd and pardon him. Eventually, a few years later, Andrew Johnson did pardon Mudd. Mudd returned home to Waldorf, Maryland. Also, Ned Spangler, the guy who held Booth's horse, was pardoned. He returned and ended up actually staying with Mudd and working on the farm with him and lived with his family until he died in 1875. So Ned Spangler and Dr. Mudd became close friends. Ultimately, neither of them lived long. Mudd died in his 40s, and, well, to this day, people still say they see Mudd's ghost around his house. There's also one more person involved I named earlier that you did not hear about being executed or imprisoned, and that was John Surratt, Mary Surratt's son. The night of the assassination, he actually fled to Canada and was eventually able to get overseas and never found. Until one day he was working with the Vatican in Rome and was brought back to the United States, but at this point the United States had moved on past the trial and were done with it, so he really didn't do any time, and he lived the rest of his life while his mother sacrificed hers. You know, kind of sad, but it's the truth. Also, Lewis Powell, remember him? Well, his body was never claimed. His body sat in D.C. for years in unmarked graves, and, well, a few years later, it was moved to a new grave and a new grave and another grave. Well, it was just moved around a lot. And, well, over a century later, his skull was actually found in the Smithsonian's artifacts. They believed it was mixed in with Native American artifacts, and somehow they had his skull. It's believed it got to them in the late 1800s somehow. The National Medical Museum had it and somehow transferred it to them, and they had it in their collection without even knowing it. Knowing this, they quickly returned it to his family, or his descendants at least, and they buried it next to his mother. Now, his body has never been found. It's believed it's in a mass grave at Rock Creek Cemetery in Washington, D.C., because it was originally at the Hallmeans graveyard in D.C., but that cemetery in the late 1800s was actually needed for more land for DCs, and there was no room for burials, so they pretty much dug up all the graves, and if no one claimed any bodies, they just dumped them all in a mass grave, and it's believed that's where Lewis Powell's body was at the time, and since there was no one to claim it, it was just buried in a mass grave at Rock Creek Cemetery. So that's a little interesting story about that. Originally, all the bodies of the conspirators were not released to their family anyways. They were buried right next to the gallows outside the D.C. Arsenal where they were hanged, and they were put in pine boxes and buried right there, including John Wilkes Booth. But eventually, Andrew Johnson did release all the bodies to the families so they could claim them, and, well, no one claimed Powell's, so that's the story of Powell's. Anyways, the Dr. Mudd House, you can go on tours at certain times of the year. It is privately owned, I believe, by the descendants. The Mudd family owns the house still, so it's not like open at specific times, but they do have tours. You can walk around and see original furniture in the house, original stuff, and people oftentimes report seeing the ghost of Dr. Mudd walk in the house and EVPs of him saying he's innocent. I hope you all enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe. And until next time, this is Fixed Image saying peace.